In this lesson, we're going to look at how we can use snapping when we're working in the viewport. We have briefly looked at a couple of the snapping modes in earlier lessons, and we've already seen that we can enable snapping by selecting one of these snapping modes from the left-hand toolbar here, or we can just tap the X key whilst hovering over the viewport to bring up the snap's radial menu. So let's start by taking a quick look at grid snapping. So I'll just click to select grid snapping from this radial menu. And in an earlier lesson, we used grid snapping to snap to points on the reference plane, but we can also use grid snapping to snap to the grid points on a construction plane. I've already got a construction grid set up to work with these control knobs on this base panel here, and I'll tap the W key to enter wireframe mode so that we can see the grid. And now I can just use this grid spacing to evenly distribute the objects along this grid by switching to the move or handle tool and simply clicking and dragging in the middle of the handle to a grid point. As I move the objects around the grid, you see that we're getting these ghosted grid points showing in the area around my cursor to indicate that these are potential snapping targets. As I move the object close to one of these, we can see it snaps to that position. The grid spacing here is at the default of 0.1 units, but as we saw in the last lesson, we can set this to be whatever we need. So that's grid snapping, and we also took a very brief look at point snapping in an earlier lesson, but let's take a bit more of a look at that now. I'll enable point snapping, and I'll do that this time by clicking on the point snap button in this left-hand toolbar. Now, if I exit the wireframe mode and turn off this construction plane, we can see I've got this extra base panel over to the side here, and let's say that I want to snap this to the side of this larger panel here. We did something similar in an earlier lesson, but with using the align state and orientation picking. But let's see how we can do the same kind of thing just using the snapping options instead. So I want to snap this front corner of this smaller base panel to this corner of the larger main panel. But to be able to do that, I actually need to move the handle first. If I don't first snap the handle to this corner point, but instead just click on this point and drag to the target point, we can see that it has moved the smaller base panel closer to that position, but it hasn't actually snapped on the corner. If I don't click and drag on the handle itself, then Houdini just takes the cursor position on the current viewing plane and snaps that to the target component. But if I click and drag on the handle, then Houdini will snap that handle position to the target component. So I'll detach the handle by tapping the apostrophe key, and then because I have point snap enabled, I can just click and drag on the handle to the point that I want to snap the handle to, and then tap the apostrophe key again to reattach the handle. And now I can just click and drag on the handle to snap it to the target point that I want to snap to. We can use the axis constraint handles in combination with snapping. So for example, if I wanted to lift this base panel up so that the bottom of its base is at exactly the same height as this horizontal midsection panel here, but keeping it in this position along the X and Z axes, then I can just click and drag on this Y axis handle and then snap to the point that I want to match the height of in Y. And we can see that we've translated the base panel to that exact height in the Y axis. If I want to move it back to align the front with this edge here, then I can just click and drag on this Z axis handle and snap to that point. So that's point snapping. Now let's take a look at primitive snapping. In Houdini, these surface faces are called primitives. If you're coming from another 3D application, you'll be used to calling these polygons. And we're going to be talking about Houdini's geometry components in detail in the next module, but for now it's sufficient just to understand that these surfaces drawn between the points and edges are what Houdini calls primitives. So I'll enable primitive snapping by tapping the X key to bring up the snap radial menu, and I'll select primitive snapping from here. I've got some more control knobs here which I want to add to the control panel, and if I select this one and click and drag in the center of the handle to be able to move it in all three axes, as I drag over the different primitive faces on the control panel base, we see they get highlighted in blue, indicating that the object will be snapped to that face. If I release left mouse on this horizontal section here, we can see that the handle of this control knob object has been snapped to that surface. We can move the object freely to any position on that primitive, but whilst we have primitive snapping enabled, the movement will be constrained to that primitive surface. Now I'll select another of these switch objects and click and drag on the middle of the transform handle again to move the object to another base panel. And you can see if I snap to one of these angle panels, the object's handle still gets snapped to that primitive, but by default it doesn't get orientated to align to the surface. We can choose to orient the object to the target component when we snap to it though, and we're going to be covering how we do that in one of the following lessons. The last of these snapping modes is MultiSnap, which I'll select by clicking on this button at the bottom of the snapping options in the left-hand toolbar. And to be able to use the MultiSnap, we need to first set it up through the MultiSnap options, which we can get to by right-clicking over the MultiSnap button, and then at the bottom here we can select multi-snapping options. And you'll notice that we can also use the hotkeys Ctrl+Shift+J to open the snapping options. I'll just click to open the snap options window, and you'll notice at the top of this we've also got tabs to be able to set snapping options for each the grid, primitive and point snapping modes. But for now we're just going to focus on this top set of options, which are unique to the MultiSnap tab. These sliders give us the ability to set multiple snapping modes at once. By default they're all turned off except for geometry point. So if you just enable multi-snapping and start using it without adjusting any of these priority options, then we just get the same behavior that we get when using point snapping. If I take this control knob here and click and drag in the middle of the handle to move it around this base panel here, we see it's simply snapping to the points of the target geometry. In fact, I'll just quickly enable the point display option so that we can clearly see that the points on this base geometry are the intersection points between these edges, and so these are the points which are being snapped to. If I enable midpoint snapping by dragging this midpoint slider to the first increment, and now move the control knob object, as I hover over the midpoint along the edge, we see we get these ghosted indicator points, which let us know that these are potential snapping targets. Now I can just drag to one of these to snap the selected object to that midpoint. So multi-snapping gives us further snapping modes beyond the 3 standard grid, primitive and point snap modes, and it also allows us to have multiple snapping modes enabled at once. So now when I move this control knob, I can snap to both geometry points and midpoints. MultiSnap also gives us the ability to snap to geometry edges. So if I enable this Geo Edge option and move the control knob once more, you see the edges are being highlighted to indicate that a snap has been made when I drag the object over an edge. But it's also become more difficult to snap to a midpoint because the midpoint is situated on the edge. And so because we've enabled snapping for both, Houdini isn't really sure whether we want to snap to the point under the cursor along the edge or to the actual midpoint on the edge. And that's where these priority sliders become useful. So if we give the geo point and the midpoint a higher priority than the edge and move the control knob object again, we can now easily and consistently snap to the geometry points and the midpoints whilst also being able to snap to an edge. If I slowly slide this control knob along the edge, as I get close to a midpoint or geometry point, we see it snap to that point because those points have a higher priority than the edge. If we were to also enable primitive snapping, but give it a higher priority than any of the other options, now if I move the object, we can see that we're snapping to the primitives, but we're no longer able to snap to edges, midpoints or geometry points. And that's because the primitive extends right from edge to edge and point to point. And so I'm always over a primitive, and as it's set as a higher priority, it's always going to override any other snap option that's currently set. So if we're going to set up MultiSnap to have all of these 4 options enabled, then we want to set them up so that the smaller scale components have a higher priority than the larger scale components. So let's set the primitive priority to 1, the Geo Edge priority to 2, and then the midpoint to 3, and the Geo point to 4. And now as I move the control knob over the base object, we can easily snap to each of those different components. In this instance, we could just set the geometry point and midpoint to have the same priority because they're fairly widely spaced out. But if we had a dense mesh with lots of points close together, then we might want to set the geometry point or the midpoint to have a higher priority depending on which we wanted to preference. There are further options that we could set here, such as grid points and grid edges, which basically allows us to enable grid snapping at the same time as geometry snapping. So let's just very quickly look at that by enabling grid point and grid edge. And I'll snap the construction plane to the center of this base object by holding down the slash key and clicking on this point in the center. And now if I move the control knob object, we can snap to any of those geometry components or grid components. There's also the option to snap to breakpoints, prim guide points, and prim guide edges, but we're not going to look at those right now. These 4 geometry options and the grid snap options are likely to be the ones which you'll be using most of the time. If you want to quickly set all the priorities back to 0, then we can just click on this clear button to do that. So that's basically how we use these 4 different snapping modes, the grid, primitive, point, and multi-snap. Over the next few lessons, we're going to look at these property options that we can use to control the snapping behavior.